Cruelty was the currency Sebastian Kane spent freely. At 34, he had inherited the Kane syndicate from his dying father and transformed a chaotic, blood-soaked organization into a corporate machine of terrifying efficiency. The 42nd floor of the glass monolith in the financial district ran on polished Italian marble, imported coffee from a Colombian farm that knew better than to disappoint, and violence that had been sterilized into spreadsheets and quarterly earnings reports. Sebastian didn't smile. He calculated. And lately, he was profoundly, dangerously bored. Julian Hart managed the spreadsheets. At 26, Julian possessed the kind of aggressive mediocrity that made people look right through him. An omega who had weaponized his own invisibility. He wore slacks the color of wet cement, high-necked blouses purchased from department stores that smelled of lavender and defeat, and scraped his nondescript ash-brown hair back into a severe clip that gave him a perpetual mild headache. He liked the headache. It kept him grounded. It kept him awake. He knew exactly who he worked for. You didn't process invoices for bulk purchases of industrial lye and plastic sheeting without piecing things together. But the medical benefits were extraordinary. His 401k was matched at 7%. And the mob, as it turned out, took workplace harassment very seriously. Someone had whistled at him during his second week. That man was subsequently transferred to the waste management division and never seen again. Julian survived by being furniture. He was the desk lamp. He was the stapler. He handed Sebastian his black coffee at precisely 8:15 every morning, ignored the occasional speck of dried rust on his expensive cuffs, and retreated to his cubicle to balance ledgers that routinely hit extortion and murder. Sebastian was an alpha of the most dangerous kind, one who had mastered his instincts completely. His dark hair was cut ruthlessly short, his eyes the color of a winter ocean. His scent was controlled, suppressed to barely a whisper of cedar and smoke, because an alpha who leaked pheromones was an alpha who revealed weakness. He ran his organization like a precision instrument, and he had no patience for the animal chaos that consumed lesser alphas. She's a robot, Sebastian. I'm telling you. Cut her open and wires fall out. Marcus Webb, Sebastian's cousin and underboss, leaned against the heavy oak of Sebastian's desk, swirling amber liquid in a crystal glass. Marcus was everything Sebastian wasn't: loud, reckless, and deeply amused by his own cruelty. A beta with alpha pretensions, he compensated for his lack of biological dominance with sheer aggressive stupidity. Sebastian didn't look up from his tablet. He's efficient. He's a ghost in orthopedic shoes. Marcus took a slow sip. Through the glass wall of the office, Julian sat at his desk, aggressively typing, his posture terrible. I bet he's never even had a drink. I bet he sleeps in a filing cabinet. I've never seen him react to anything. Jimmy got shot in the lobby last month. He just stepped over the blood and asked if the elevators were still running. He had a quarterly tax filing due that morning, Sebastian murmured, his tone devoid of inflection. Come on, Sebastian. Where's your sense of humor? Marcus pushed off the desk, his eyes gleaming with malicious intent. The Solstice Gala is Friday. Every heavy hitter from the 5 families is going to be there. Bring him. Sebastian finally stopped scrolling. He looked up, his pale eyes pinning his cousin. Bring my secretary to the Solstice Gala? Yes. Marcus grinned, showing teeth. Tell him it's a mandatory corporate function. Tell him to dress nice. Watch him show up in a tweed skirt suit and sensible flats. The dawn of the Kane family walking in with a librarian. The looks on their faces alone will be worth it. And watching him try to hold a conversation with Victor from the Bratva? He'll probably try to offer him a spreadsheet. It's a flawless joke. Sebastian looked back through the glass. Julian was squinting at his monitor, chewing absent-mindedly on the end of a cheap plastic pen. He looked utterly out of place in the sleek, predatory environment of the 42nd floor. He looked soft, dull, entirely breakable. A cruel, idle flicker of amusement sparked in Sebastian's chest. It was a terrible idea. It was petty. It was beneath him. If he cries, Sebastian said, his voice quiet, you're cleaning up the mess. Deal. Marcus laughed. 10 minutes later, Sebastian opened the glass door. The ambient hum of the floor died down instantly, as it always did when he emerged. He walked to Julian's desk. Julian didn't look up until Sebastian tapped a knuckle against the laminate surface. Mr. Kane, Julian said, his voice flat, professional. The offshore accounts have been reconciled. The discrepancy was a rounding error in the Cayman branch. Good. Sebastian studied his face. No makeup. A slight smudge of ink on his left cheekbone. Eyes the color of weak tea. And beneath the carefully neutral scent-masking products, something else. Something faint and floral, like night-blooming jasmine, that Sebastian had never noticed before. He filed it away. Clear your schedule for Friday evening. Julian blinked. Friday evening? After 6. 8 o'clock. Is there an emergency audit? Julian reached for his planner, a battered, color-coded monstrosity. It's a dinner. Sebastian watched him carefully for a reaction. The Solstice Gala. The Continental Hotel. It's mandatory for senior staff. A lie. Julian wasn't senior staff. He was an admin. Julian's hand hovered over his planner. He looked up at Sebastian. For a fraction of a second, Sebastian saw something sharp flash in those dull brown eyes, something that looked startlingly like comprehension. But then it was gone, buried under a lifetime of practiced compliance. I see, Julian said. Or something nice. Sebastian's words felt surprisingly heavy on his tongue. It's a formal event. Of course, Mr. Kane. Julian's tone was perfectly even. Will you require me to bring the Q3 projection files? Or is this strictly a networking event? Just bring yourself, Mr. Hart. Sebastian turned and walked away, feeling a sudden, inexplicable twist of guilt in his gut. He pushed it down. It was just a dinner. A harmless bit of sport. The lions playing with the mouse before the slaughter. Julian did not cry when he got home. He locked the deadbolt of his cramped fourth-floor walk-up, kicked off his sensible shoes, and stared at the peeling paint on his ceiling. He wasn't stupid. You don't survive 3 years in the epicenter of an organized crime syndicate by being oblivious. He knew exactly what the Solstice Gala was. He managed the catering budget for it. He knew the guest list. It was a viper's nest of murderers, extortionists, and sociopaths in bespoke suits. And he knew why Sebastian Kane had invited him. He had seen Marcus Webb looking at him through the glass. He had seen the smirks. They thought he was a punchline, the invisible, pathetic Omega secretary dragged into the glittering, blood-soaked light of their world just so they could watch him squirm. They wanted to see him shrink. They wanted to laugh into their champagne flutes as he stood in a corner, clutching a cheap purse, drowning in his own inadequacy. Julian walked into his tiny bathroom and looked at himself in the harsh fluorescent light. He looked tired. He looked exactly like a man drowning in $90,000 of student loan debt, working a job that routinely threatened his immortal soul just to keep the lights on. He looked like a target. Not this time. He whispered to the mirror. He was exhausted from shrinking. He was so incredibly tired of folding himself into tiny, unnoticeable squares so that loud, dangerous alphas wouldn't look at him twice. The suppression patches on his neck itched with the effort of hiding his Omega biology. Every day, he plastered them on, scrubbing away his natural scent, pretending to be a beta, pretending to be nothing. It was exhausting. It was degrading. And it had kept him alive. They wanted a joke. Fine. But Julian was the one who balanced their books. He knew the margins. He knew how to calculate a return on investment. He walked over to his laptop, opened it, and logged into his savings account. $6,000. His emergency fund. 6 months of safety if the syndicate ever went under or he got caught in a crossfire. He transferred $5,000 to his checking account. The next evening, after work, Julian did not go back to his walk-up. He took a cab to Fifth Avenue. He walked into a boutique that had a security guard at the door and no price tags on the clothes. The saleswoman, a severe beta with architectural hair, took one look at Julian's gray slacks and opened her mouth, likely to direct him to a department store down the street. I need a suit, Julian said, cutting her off. His voice lacked its usual office timidity. It was flat, hard, and entirely uncompromising. I have a budget of $4,000. It needs to be tailored. It needs to be black. And it needs to look like it could cut a man's throat. The saleswoman paused. A slow, terrifying smile spread across her face. Right this way. The transformation was not a fairy tale. There were no singing birds, no magical pumpkins. It was a cold, calculated assembling of armor. The suit they found was a masterpiece of structural engineering and dark silk. It didn't sparkle. It absorbed light. The jacket was cut razor-sharp, emphasizing the breadth of his shoulders and tapering to a waist that had been aggressively hidden beneath wool and polyester for years. The trousers were slim, flowing, and entirely unforgiving. It fit him like a second layer of skin, revealing a body he had spent the last decade hiding. He bought shoes that were less footwear and more weapons, Oxfords with actual steel tips. He bought a watch that looked like a jagged piece of obsidian. By Friday afternoon, he had taken a half day. He sat in a salon chair and let a stranger wash the grayness out of his life. "What are we doing?" the stylist asked, running hands through Julian's mousy hair. "I want it dark. Espresso. And cut it, a bob, sharp." Julian watched pieces of his camouflage fall to the floor. The ash brown gave way to a rich, glossy darkness that made his pale skin look luminous rather than sickly. The blunt cut framed his jawline, highlighting bone structure he had forgotten he possessed. When it came time for grooming, he didn't ask for natural. He didn't ask for pretty. He asked for war. He shaved carefully, using a straight razor, leaving his skin smooth and unforgiving. He applied a subtle contour that sharpened his cheekbones and jawline, and darkened his brows into dramatic arches. He painted his lips with a matte stain that looked like dried blood. He removed the suppression patches from his neck, just for tonight, and let his natural scent bloom. It was jasmine and something darker, like rain-soaked earth, like a storm approaching. When he finally stood up and looked in the full-length mirror, his breath caught in his throat. The man staring back at him was a stranger. He was dangerous. He looked like the kind of Omega who didn't keep the books for the Mafia, but the kind who owned them. The kind who had stopped running and started hunting. He slipped the heavy, cold silk of the suit over his shoulders. He stepped into the steel-tipped Oxfords. He grabbed the obsidian watch. He didn't feel like a secretary. He felt like a loaded gun. "Let's go hear the punchline," he murmured to the empty room. The Continental Hotel ballroom smelled of orchids, expensive bourbon, and barely concealed malice. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over a sea of custom tuxedos and designer gowns. A string quartet played Vivaldi in the corner, trying their best to ignore the fact that at least half the men in the room were actively plotting to murder the other half. Sebastian stood near the central bar, a glass of scotch loose in his grip. He was in his element, nodding to underbosses, accepting the terrified, respectful greetings of minor associates. Yet there was a tight coil of tension at the base of his neck. He kept glancing at his watch. 8:15. Julian was late. Julian Hart was never late. In 3 years, he had never been a minute past 8 in the morning. He bailed, Marcus said, appearing at Sebastian's elbow, looking smug. He plucked a piece of lint off his velvet lapel. "I told you." He probably got to the lobby, saw a guy with a gun bulge, and ran crying back to his cats. "He doesn't have cats," Sebastian said mechanically. "Whatever. The point is, your little pet ghost couldn't handle the pressure. Honestly, it's for the best. Having him stand around looking like a substitute teacher would have killed the vibe." Sebastian didn't answer. He stared at the amber liquid in his glass. He felt a heavy, ugly sensation settling in his stomach. It wasn't disappointment. It was shame. He had bullied a civilian. He had used his power to humiliate an Omega who did nothing but keep his empire organized. It was a sloppy, arrogant move. It made him feel entirely too much like his father. "I'm going to get another drink," Sebastian muttered, turning away from Marcus. "Suit yourself," Marcus laughed. "I'm going to go find the Bratva guys. See if they want to bet on how long it takes you to fire him on Monday." Sebastian took a step toward the bartender. And then the room changed. It wasn't a sudden silence. It was a physical shift in the atmosphere, like the drop in barometric pressure right before a violent storm. The low hum of conversation faltered. The string quartet missed a beat, the cellist's bow scraping harshly against the strings before recovering. Heads began to turn, one by one, toward the grand brass doors at the entrance of the ballroom. Sebastian stopped. The hairs on his arms stood up. It was an alpha's instinct. The collective attention of 100 dangerous men had just zeroed in on a single point in space. And beneath the attention, there was something else. Something that made his blood run hot and cold at the same time. A scent. Jasmine and rain. A storm approaching. An Omega's scent, powerful and unapologetic, washing over the room like a tidal wave. It was intoxicating. It was terrifying. It was wrong in a place like this, where everyone suppressed their biology behind layers of chemicals and control. Sebastian turned slowly, expecting to see some rival alpha's consort, some beautiful Omega dragged here as arm candy. He saw Julian. For 3 full seconds, Sebastian Kane's brain completely failed to process the visual information being sent to it. Julian was standing at the top of the short staircase that led down into the ballroom. The light from the chandeliers caught the razor-sharp lines of his black suit, the gunmetal cufflinks that caught the light like shards of glass. The jacket hugged his shoulders and tapered to a waist that Sebastian had never noticed existed. The trousers flowed like liquid darkness, pooling around steel-tipped Oxfords that struck the marble steps with a rhythmic, terrifying cadence of a metronome. His dark hair was a sharp, glossy helmet that framed a face carved out of ice. His lips were a slash of violence red. His eyes, those dull, weak tea eyes, were lined in harsh black, sharp and unforgiving. Men were staring. Men who routinely dealt in human currency, men who bought and sold Omegas like property, were completely immobilized. Julian didn't look pretty. He looked ruinous. Marcus, standing 10 feet away, dropped his champagne flute. It shattered on the marble floor. Sebastian couldn't breathe. His lungs felt tightly banded in iron. Every drop of blood in his body seemed to rush instantly to his head, leaving his extremities cold and numb. His alpha instincts, so carefully controlled, roared to life in his chest. Mine. That Omega is mine. This was Julian. The man who brought him coffee. The man who asked questions about the deductible on the company dental plan. The man who had been hiding, in plain sight for 3 years. Julian reached the bottom of the stairs. He didn't hesitate. He didn't look down at his feet. He looked straight across the room, his dark, heavily lined eyes sweeping the crowd with absolute disdain until they locked onto Sebastian. The impact of that stare hit Sebastian like a physical blow. Julian began to walk toward him. The crowd parted. They actually parted, hardened killers stepping aside, offering him a wide berth, sensing instinctively that he was not prey. Sebastian's grip on his scotch glass tightened until his knuckles were white. He couldn't move. He felt rooted to the floor. The cruel joke he and Marcus had constructed was rapidly dissolving, replaced by a terrifying, electric reality. Julian stopped 3 feet in front of him, close enough that Sebastian could smell him. Not department store lavender, but ozone, a struck match, and that dark, intoxicating jasmine. Mr. Kane, Julian said. His voice was the same, calm, even, precise. But framed by the red lips and the harsh light, it sounded like a threat. Sebastian opened his mouth. His mind, usually a steel trap of tactics and rhetoric, was entirely blank. "You're late," he managed to say. It was a stupid, weak thing to say, and he hated himself the second the words left his mouth. Julian did not flinch. He tilted his chin up slightly, his dark eyes pinning Sebastian to the wall behind him. "You didn't specify a time, Mr. Kane." Julian's voice was smooth, unhurried. He glanced around the room, taking in the staring faces, the paralyzed crowd, and then looked back at Sebastian. A slow, terrifyingly cold smile curved the edges of his red lips. "I assumed you wanted me to make an entrance. Does this meet corporate requirements?" Sebastian stared at him. The air between them felt thick, charged with a sudden, violent gravity. He had invited a mouse to a slaughterhouse to watch it die. He realized, with a cold spike of adrenaline, that he had accidentally invited a wolf. It exceeds them, Sebastian murmured, his voice dropping an octave, completely outside his control. His alpha instincts were screaming. Not just mine, but worthy. Equal. Dangerous. Excellent. Julian shifted his weight, the silk of his jacket sliding smoothly over his hip. Now, which one of these gentlemen is the contact for the Cayman accounts? I have some questions about their recent overhead expenses. He wasn't here to survive the joke. He was here to own the punchline. Sebastian looked at this man, this stranger who had been hiding in plain sight in his office for 3 years, and for the first time in a decade, the dawn of the Kane family felt genuine, unadulterated awe. And right behind it, a desperate, consuming hunger. Sebastian did not know what to do with his hands. For a man who regularly ordered the dismantling of rival organizations before his morning espresso, the sudden loss of basic motor function was alarming. He finally shoved his hands into his trouser pockets, a tight, defensive posture, as he fell into step beside Julian. Julian did not wait for him to lead. He cut through the ballroom like a knife through soft tissue. The men who had mocked his existence hours earlier now pressed themselves against the high-top tables to let him pass. They stared at the severe line of his bob, the pale expanse of his neck where the suppression patches should have been, and the jagged, expensive watch he wore like a weapon. "Langdon," Julian said quietly, not looking at Sebastian as they walked. "Arthur Langdon. He handles the routing through the Grand Cayman Shell companies." "Correct." Sebastian's voice sounded thin to his own ears. He cleared his throat. "He's standing by the ice sculpture. Gray suit. Sweating. He should be." Julian's voice was the auditory equivalent of a scalpel. Arthur Langdon was a nervous, dumpy man who skimmed a negligible fraction off the top of the syndicate's laundered funds. It was an amount so small Sebastian hadn't bothered to kill him for it yet. Finding a reliable offshore banker was tedious, and a little theft was the cost of doing business. Langdon watched them approach. His eyes darted from Sebastian's dark, unreadable expression to the terrifying Omega walking in sync with him. He gripped his martini glass with white knuckles. "Arthur," Sebastian said, his tone flat. "Mr. Kane." Langdon squeaked. He looked at Julian. He tried to swallow, but his throat appeared to have seized. "And, your guest." "Julian Hart." Julian introduced himself. He did not extend his hand. He merely stopped 2 feet in front of Langdon, letting the silence stretch until it became a physical weight. "A pleasure, Mr. Hart," Langdon lied. "Mr. Langdon." Julian's voice was calm, unhurried. "I was reviewing the Q3 routing protocols. Specifically, the transfer delays between the Shell entity in Nassau and the primary holding account in Georgetown. There seems to be a consistent 48-hour lag. A lag that, given the current interest rates on short-term overnight holds, generates a rather specific yield." Langdon stopped breathing. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin the color of old oatmeal. Sebastian watched him. Then, slowly, he turned his head to look at his secretary. His secretary. The thought sent a possessive thrill through him. I don't know what you mean," Langdon stammered, looking pleadingly at Sebastian. "International transfers take time. Bank compliance. Bank compliance is automated." Julian cut in smoothly. "I ran the algorithms on the Swift network logs. The delay isn't systemic. It's manual. Someone is holding the funds in a high-yield intermediary account for exactly 2 days before passing the principal along to us. They are keeping the interest." He took a slow, calculated sip from a glass of sparkling water he had acquired from a passing tray. He let the silence hang heavy and suffocating. "Over 3 years," Julian continued, his dark eyes entirely devoid of mercy. "That stolen interest compounds. It amounts to roughly $412,000. Give or take exchange rate fluctuations." Langdon's martini glass slipped from his fingers. It hit the carpeted floor with a dull thud, the gin soaking into the expensive wool. Sebastian felt a cold, sharp thrill race up his spine. He had known Langdon was skimming. He had estimated it at perhaps 50 grand a year. He hadn't realized the rat was stealing over 100,000. Or exactly how he was doing it. Sebastian, I swear, Langdon choked out, taking a step backward. He's making it up. Who is this? Some auditor. He's my secretary. Sebastian's voice was soft. A slow, dangerous smile finally broke across his face. The first time he had smiled all week. And he balances my books. Marcus Webb materialized from the crowd, a fresh champagne flute in hand, looking flushed and irritated by the sudden shift in the room's center of gravity. He barged into the circle, looking Julian up and down with a mixture of hostility and blatant, predatory hunger. What's going on here? Marcus demanded. He aimed a sneer at Julian. Nice costume, Hart. Rented by the hour. It was a crude, stupid attempt to reassert dominance, to put him back in his box. Julian didn't blink. He turned his head slowly to look at Marcus. Mr. Webb. His voice dropped to a conversational murmur that somehow carried over the string quartet. I noticed the catering budget for your sector's weekly meetings has increased by 40% this quarter. The invoices, You are ordering imported Wagyu for 15 men every Tuesday. Yet the meat supplier you use is owned by your brother-in-law. Marcus froze, his mouth half open. If you are going to embezzle from your own cousin, Julian said, leaning in just a fraction of an inch, the scent of ozone and jasmine washing over him. I suggest you don't do it through a paper trail of steaks. It's uninspired. And it insults my intelligence when I have to file it. He turned back to a hyperventilating Arthur Langdon. Have the missing 412,000 wired to the primary operational account by Monday at 9 a.m., Mr. Langdon. Or Mr. Kane will stop delegating to me and start delegating to the men standing by the exits. Julian didn't wait for a response. He turned on his steel-tipped heel and walked toward the terrace doors. Sebastian watched him go. He looked at Langdon, who was clutching his chest, and then at Marcus, who looked as though he had just been hit by a cement truck. Monday at 9, Sebastian repeated to Langdon. He left his underboss and his corrupt banker drowning in their own panic and followed his secretary out into the cold. The air on the terrace was sharp, biting through the thin silk of Julian's suit the moment he stepped outside. He walked to the heavy stone balustrade, gripping the cold granite with both hands. Below him, the city was a grid of gold and red light, moving and breathing in the dark. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. His hands were shaking violently. He pressed his forehead against the cold stone, forcing himself to draw long, deliberate breaths. He had done it. He had dropped the match. But the adrenaline was receding now, leaving behind a cold, terrifying reality. He had just publicly humiliated an underboss and threatened a cartel banker. He had painted a massive neon target on his own back. And he had done it all while his scent was broadcasting his omega nature to every alpha in that room. The heavy glass door clicked open and shut. Heavy, measured footsteps crossed the concrete. Julian didn't turn around. He knew the cadence of Sebastian's walk. Sebastian stopped beside him. He didn't speak immediately. He took a silver case from his inside pocket, extracted a cigarette, and lit it. The flare of the lighter illuminated his sharp profile, the heavy exhaustion around his eyes, the brutal set of his jaw. He snapped the lighter shut and exhaled a plume of gray smoke into the freezing air. "You're shaking," he said. His voice wasn't the flat, dead tone he used in the office. It was quiet, rough. "It's 30 degrees, Mr. Kane," Julian replied, keeping his gaze fixed on the traffic below. Sebastian shrugged off his suit jacket, a bespoke piece, heavy wool and silk lining. He stepped closer and draped it over Julian's shoulders. The jacket was warm. It smelled of cedar, tobacco, and the violent, expensive world he inhabited. And beneath it, the unmistakable scent of an alpha, dark, possessive, intoxicating. Julian stiffened but didn't pull away. He pulled the lapels tighter around his chest. 3 years. Sebastian leaned his forearms on the balustrade, staring out at the skyline. You've been sitting outside my door for 3 years, wearing gray wool, apologizing when the copier jammed, acting like a loud noise might kill you, hiding your scent, hiding everything. A loud noise on the 42nd floor usually involves a hollow point bullet, Julian pointed out dryly. Flinching is a logical survival mechanism. Sebastian turned his head to look at him. The harsh terrace lighting cast deep shadows under his cheekbones. Why? Why hide? You have a mind like a steel trap. You just gutted Langdon in 60 seconds. You could have been running the entire accounting division. I would have paid you triple. And you're an Omega, a powerful one. You're sent. He inhaled deeply, his eyes darkening. Do you know what you've been doing to my alpha instincts for 3 years? Making me think you were a beta? Julian finally turned to face him. The anger he had been suppressing for years flared up, burning away the residual fear. You wouldn't have paid me triple, he said, his voice hard. You would have noticed me. And in this world, Omegas who get noticed don't survive. Not unless they have protection. Not unless they're owned by someone powerful enough to keep the predators away. Sebastian frowned, a slight crease forming between his brows. Look at this room, Julian said, gesturing blindly backward toward the glass doors of the ballroom. Look at the men in there. Look at Marcus. Look at you. You run a machine built on violence, paranoia, and ego. Do you know what happens to Omegas who stand out in this world? Omegas who show they are smart, or competent, or dangerous. Sebastian stayed silent, the ash on his cigarette burning down. They become threats. Julian answered his own question. Or they become property. They get targeted by alphas like your cousin who resent being outsmarted by someone they consider furniture. I have $90,000 in student loan debt, Mr. Kane. My mother is in a memory care facility that costs $6,000 a month. I needed the salary. I needed the medical benefits. I didn't need to prove a point. He stepped away from the balustrade, turning fully toward Sebastian. The oversized suit jacket swallowed his frame, but he looked 10 times larger than he ever had in his cubicle. So I wore the gray slacks, Julian continued, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and exhaustion. I wore the clip in my hair. I scrubbed off my scent with suppression patches every morning. I stared at the floor. I let Marcus call me a ghost. Because being invisible was the only way to stay safe in a building full of predators. Sebastian felt a tight, painful knot form in his chest. It was a foreign sensation. It took him a long moment to identify it as shame. He had thought he was a good boss. He kept the violence out of the corporate offices. He paid well. But he had been entirely blind to the reality of the ecosystem he oversaw. He had let Marcus sneer. And worse, he had brought Julian here tonight as a joke. He had tried to strip away his armor just to alleviate his own boredom. And tonight, Sebastian's voice was low. Why drop the act tonight? Julian let out a harsh, humorless laugh. Because you dragged me into the spotlight. I knew why you invited me. I heard Marcus. I knew the punchline. He took a step closer to Sebastian, tilting his head back to meet his eyes. If I had walked in there tonight in my cardigan, you would have laughed. Marcus would have laughed. I would have remained a joke. But I would have been a humiliated joke. The invisibility wouldn't work anymore. You forced my hand. If I was going to be pushed into the snake pit, I was going to make sure the snakes knew I had teeth. Sebastian stared down at him. The anger in Julian's eyes was magnificent. It was raw, real, and entirely justified. Julian had played the game perfectly for 3 years, and Sebastian had broken the board on a whim. But more than that, he saw something else in those dark eyes, fear. Not of him, but of what came next. Of the consequences. You made an enemy out of Marcus tonight, Sebastian said, stating a logistical fact. He's petty. He holds grudges. I'm aware. Langdon will likely panic and try to run. He'll be dealt with before Monday, but it leaves a gap in the offshore routing. I can reroute the Nassau accounts through a different shell in Belize, Julian said instantly, without missing a beat. It will reduce the transfer time to 12 hours and scrub the digital footprint cleaner than Langdon ever managed. Sebastian let out a slow breath. A heavy silence settled between them, punctuated only by the distant wail of a police siren on the streets below. The dynamic between them had fractured irrevocably. The desk lamp had just plugged itself into the city's main power grid. Monday morning, Sebastian said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. You don't wear the gray slacks. Julian tightened his grip on Sebastian's jacket. Are you firing me, Mr. Kane? No. Sebastian stepped forward, closing the distance between them until he could smell the ozone and jasmine again. He looked down at the harsh red of Julian's lips, the sharp intelligence in his eyes, and the terrifying, beautiful anger radiating from his skin. I'm promoting you. He didn't wait for Julian to process it. He reached out and caught Julian's chin, tilting his face up. It was a possessive gesture, an alpha's gesture, and Julian's breath caught in his throat. But he didn't pull away. I'm sorry, Sebastian said, the words tasting foreign on his tongue. For the joke. For making you feel like prey. That was beneath me. Julian's eyes widened slightly. The apology seemed to catch him off guard. I'm not a good man, Sebastian continued, his thumb tracing the sharp line of Julian's jaw. But I'm not my father. And I'm not Marcus. I see you now, Julian. I see everything you are. And I'm not letting you disappear again. Julian's lips parted slightly, his sense spiking with something that wasn't fear. It was surprise, yes, but beneath it, hope. A fragile, terrified hope. This is a dangerous world, Julian whispered. You know what happens to omegas who belong to powerful alphas? They become targets. They become leverage. Then I'll make sure everyone knows you're not leverage, Sebastian said, his voice hardening. You're not property, Julian. You're my partner. My equal. Anyone who touches you answers to me. Personally. Julian stared at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, a small, genuine smile curved his lips. Not the cold, terrifying smile from the ballroom, but something softer, more real. That's a lot of promises, Mr. Kane. Sebastian, he corrected, his voice rough. Call me Sebastian. And I don't make promises I can't keep. He turned and walked back toward the glass doors of the ballroom, the cold air hitting him, bracing and sharp. He had a cartel banker to hunt down, an underboss to muzzle, and a new reality to build. The joke was over. Monday morning arrived with the gray, biting chill typical of November in the city. The 42nd floor hummed with its usual predatory efficiency. Keyboards clacked. Espresso machines hissed. Men in dark suits moved with the silent, hurried purpose of people who knew failure was not a fireable offense, but a fatal one. At precisely 8:15, the elevator doors chimed and slid open. Julian Hart stepped onto the floor. He did not wear gray wool. He wore a tailored charcoal pinstriped suit that hugged his shoulders and flared perfectly at the ankles. The cheap plastic clip was gone. His dark hair fell in a sharp, blunt line that framed his jaw. He wore black leather Oxfords that echoed sharply against the Italian marble, devoid of steel tips, but carrying the exact same threat. His lipstick was a muted, business-appropriate plum, but his eyes were lined in sharp, unforgiving black. And his scent, jasmine and rain, was completely unapologetic, broadcasting his omega nature to everyone in the room. The silence that rolled across the floor was not immediate. It was a wave. It started at the reception desk, where the administrative assistant actually stopped typing, her jaw going slack. It rippled through the bullpen. Conversations died mid-sentence. Eyes tracked Julian's progress as he bypassed the admin cluster entirely. He walked toward the executive suites. Specifically, he walked toward the corner office adjacent to Sebastian's, a space that had sat vacant since the former CFO was indicted and subsequently disappeared 3 years ago. The heavy glass door was open. Julian's name was already etched onto a brushed steel plaque mounted on the drywall. Julian Hart, Director of Financial Operations. He stepped inside. The office was sprawling, walled in glass, overlooking the harbor. A massive mahogany desk dominated the center. On it sat 2 curved monitors, a state-of-the-art encrypted phone line, and a single black coffee, still steaming. Julian set his leather briefcase down. He looked at the coffee. He didn't have to ask who put it there. I prefer it with a dash of oat milk now, he said to the empty room. Noted. Sebastian stepped out from the adjoining private corridor that connected their offices. He wore a navy suit, no tie, the top 2 buttons of his shirt undone. He looked rested, which was a lie. He hadn't slept since Friday. He had spent the weekend dismantling Arthur Langdon's life, seizing his assets, and ensuring the terrified banker was placed on a permanent one-way flight to a country without an extradition treaty. Sebastian leaned against the doorframe, watching Julian. He was studying him with an intensity that made the hair on Julian's arms stand up. Is the desk satisfactory? He asked. It's loud, Julian said, running a hand over the polished wood. But it will hold the offshore ledgers. Langdon is gone. The gap in the routing is open. We have 48 hours before the holding accounts in Nassau trigger an automatic audit from the Shell board. I told you on Friday, Julian replied, pulling out his chair and sitting down. He booted up the monitors. I can reroute through Belize. I just need authorization codes and your digital signature to bypass the secondary protocols. You have them. Sebastian pulled a silver flash drive from his pocket and tossed it onto the desk. It clattered against the wood. Everything is on there. You have full systemic control. Julian looked at the drive. It was the digital key to the Kane Syndicate's entire treasury, billions of dollars in laundered funds, extortion rackets, and legitimate real estate holdings. Sebastian was handing it to an Omega who 72 hours ago he had thought was an invisible secretary. You're trusting me with the treasury? Julian's voice was flat, masking a sudden spike of adrenaline. I'm trusting you to be exactly who you showed me you were on Friday night, Sebastian corrected. A man who understands the margins better than anyone else in this building. Before Julian could respond, the heavy glass door of his office swung open with enough force to crack the hinges. Marcus Webb stormed in. His face was flushed, a dark, violent red. He didn't look at Julian. He marched straight toward Sebastian. What the hell is this? Marcus demanded, gesturing wildly around the room. He gets the corner office? He gets the director title? He's a glorified typist, Sebastian. You're making a mockery of the chain of command. Sebastian didn't move. He didn't blink. The shift in his demeanor was absolute. The quiet, intense man who had just handed over his financial empire vanished, replaced instantly by the Don. Marcus. Sebastian's voice dropped to a terrifyingly calm whisper. Lower your voice. Marcus ignored the warning. He turned his vitriol on Julian, slamming his hands flat on the mahogany desk. You think because you put on some makeup and play dress-up at a gala, you're suddenly a made man? You're a civilian. You don't know how this world works. The moment things get bloody, you're going to break. And you're an Omega, a weak, pathetic. Julian did not flinch. He slowly folded his hands over the silver flash drive. He looked up at Marcus, his expression completely devoid of emotion. Mr. Webb, Julian said, his voice cutting through Marcus's tirade like a blade. I am currently reviewing the discretionary funds for your enforcement operations in the Garment District. You are operating at a 22% loss year over year. You are paying off inspectors who have already been indicted by the state, which means you are throwing syndicate funds into a black hole. Marcus's mouth opened, but no sound came out. As of this morning, Julian continued smoothly. Your discretionary budget is frozen. Every expenditure over $500 will require my direct written approval. If you want to buy a box of bullets, you will submit an itemized receipt. Marcus turned slowly to Sebastian, his eyes wide with outrage. You're going to let him do this? He's cutting my legs out from under me. He is stopping you from bleeding my money, Sebastian corrected. His eyes were dead, fixed on his cousin. He is the director of finance. You answer to him on all monetary issues. If you speak to him with that tone again, if you so much as look at him wrong, you will find yourself managing the waste disposal routes in Staten Island. Are we clear? The silence in the office was suffocating. Marcus stared at Sebastian, realizing with a cold shock that his cousin was not bluffing. The hierarchy had shifted. The joke had become the judge. Marcus swallowed hard, his jaw tight. He shot one last venomous look at Julian. "This is a mistake, Sebastian." He turned and stalked out of the office, letting the glass door slam shut behind him. Julian sat perfectly still until his heavy footsteps faded down the hall. Slowly, he exhaled, his shoulders dropping a fraction of an inch. "He's going to retaliate," Julian said quietly. "Let him try." Sebastian walked over to the desk, leaning down slightly, so he was at Julian's eye level. The scent of cedar and cold air washed over him. "You handle the math, Julian. I handle the monsters." Julian looked up at him. Really looked. For the first time, he let himself see the alpha beneath the Don's mask. The exhaustion in his eyes. The genuine concern. The hunger that he was barely controlling. "Sebastian," Julian said softly. "Why are you doing this? Promoting me? Trusting me? What?" Sebastian was silent for a long moment. Then he reached out, slowly, giving Julian time to pull away. When Julian didn't, he brushed a strand of dark hair from his forehead, his fingers lingering against his skin. "Because I see you now," Sebastian said, his voice rough with emotion. "I see everything you are, and I've spent 3 years blind. I'm not making that mistake again." Julian's breath caught. His scent spiked. Jasmine and rain, sweet and sharp, betraying him. He was terrified of how much he wanted this. How much he wanted Sebastian. "I don't know how to do this," Julian admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've spent my whole life hiding. From alphas. From everyone. I don't know how to be seen." "Then let me show you." Sebastian's hand cupped his jaw, tilting his face up. His thumb traced the sharp line of Julian's cheekbone. "You're not alone anymore, Julian. Not in this. Not in anything. Whatever comes, Marcus, the other families, the feds, we face it together." Julian closed his eyes, leaning into the touch. It was terrifying. It was the most alive he had felt in years. "Together," he repeated, testing the word. "Together," Sebastian confirmed. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't need to. Julian opened his eyes, and in them was all the permission Sebastian would ever need. Sebastian closed the final inch between them, his mouth coming down on Julian's. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a collision. 3 years of suppressed tension, the residual adrenaline of surviving the gala, and the violent, consuming realization that they were exact mirrors of each other. Julian grabbed the front of Sebastian's shirt, pulling him closer, matching his desperate intensity. He tasted like coffee and danger. Sebastian tasted like power and cedar. Sebastian's hands found Julian's waist, anchoring him to the desk. He kissed him like a man drowning, hard, hungry, claiming. And Julian kissed him back with equal ferocity, his hands fisting in Sebastian's shirt, pulling him impossibly closer. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Julian kept his hands fisted in Sebastian's shirt, his forehead resting against his chest, listening to the heavy, erratic thud of his heart. "Marcus is going to make a move," Julian said quietly, the reality of their world bleeding back into the room. "I know." Sebastian's arms tightened around him. "He's bleeding money. Desperate. Desperate men get sloppy. He'll try to bypass the new protocols. And when he can't, he'll come for me. He won't get within 10 miles of you." Sebastian's voice hardened into absolute certainty. "If Marcus steps out of line, I won't reassign him. I'll bury him." Julian pulled back slightly, looking up into the cold, pale eyes of the dawn. "No." Sebastian frowned. "No. Don't bury him," Julian said, a slow, terrifying smile curving his lips. "Audit him publicly. Strip his assets. Freeze his accounts. Force him to explain every stolen dime to the commission. Let him survive, but make him irrelevant. Death makes a martyr. Poverty makes a joke." Sebastian stared at him. A low, dark laugh rumbled in his chest. It was a sound of pure, unfiltered reverence. He had built a fortress of violence, and Julian had just shown him how to weaponize the architecture. "You," Sebastian whispered, leaning down to press a hard kiss to Julian's jaw, are going to be the absolute ruin of this syndicate. I am going to double your profit margins, Julian corrected, his hands sliding up to frame Sebastian's face. And I'm going to look devastating doing it. 3 weeks passed. The transition was brutal, exhausting, and entirely seamless. Julian reorganized the syndicate's financial architecture with the ruthlessness of a surgeon excising a tumor. He cut off dead weight. He streamlined the extortion payouts. He terrified the operational captains simply by emailing them spreadsheets with their inefficiencies highlighted in glaring red. They quickly learned that a summons to his corner office was far worse than a physical beating. You could heal from a broken jaw. You couldn't heal from Julian Hart auditing your life. He worked 15-hour days. Sebastian matched him. They existed in a state of high-functioning, heavily caffeinated isolation in their adjoining offices. The glass wall between them had been frosted over for security, but the private corridor remained open. They passed each other files, shared cold takeout dinners at midnight, spoke in a shorthand language of risk assessment and asset reallocation. And in the quiet moments between, they learned each other. Sebastian learned that Julian had grown up poor, the only omega in a family of betas who never understood him. He learned that Julian's mother had been diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's when he was 19, and he'd been caring for her ever since. He learned that Julian hadn't been with anyone in years, not because he didn't want to, but because trusting alphas was a luxury he couldn't afford. Julian learned that Sebastian had been raised by a monster. His father, the previous Don, had believed that alphas ruled through fear and violence alone. Sebastian had been beaten, starved, and forced to suppress his instincts to survive. He had rebuilt the syndicate from the inside out, but he had never learned how to connect with another person. Until now. I don't know what I'm doing, Sebastian admitted one night, lying on the couch in Julian's office, watching him work. With you. I don't know how to do this. Julian looked up from his screen, a soft smile playing on his lips. Neither do I. But we're figuring it out. I've never. Sebastian paused, searching for words. I've never let myself want anything like this. Want someone like this. It's a weakness. It's not a weakness. Julian stood and walked over to the couch, sitting down beside him. It's a choice. And it's the bravest thing you've ever done. Sebastian reached out, pulling Julian closer, burying his face in the crook of his neck. The scent of jasmine and rain was intoxicating, calming the alpha instincts that were always bristling just beneath the surface. Julian's hand stroked through his dark hair, and Sebastian felt something loosen in his chest. I love you, Sebastian murmured against his skin. The words came out unbidden, raw and honest. I know it's too soon. I know it's irrational, but I can't help it. I love you, Julian. Julian's breath caught. His hand stilled in Sebastian's hair. For a long moment, he was silent. Sebastian braced himself for the worst, for rejection, for fear, for the walls to come back up. But then Julian pulled back, cupping Sebastian's face in his hands. His dark eyes were bright, with unshed tears. I love you too, Julian whispered. God help me. I love you too. Sebastian kissed him then, slow, tender, reverent. It was nothing like their first kiss. This was a promise. A vow. A new beginning. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday night at 1 a.m. Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Julian's office, distorting the city lights into angry, bleeding streaks of neon. The floor was entirely empty, plunged into darkness save for the pools of light radiating from his desk lamps. Julian was staring at a line of code on his primary monitor, rubbing his temples. A dull, pulsing headache had settled behind his eyes around 8 o'clock and refused to leave. It bounced again, he muttered. Sebastian appeared in the doorway, holding 2 glasses of scotch. He walked in, setting one down near Julian's keyboard. The Belize route. Yes. Julian picked up the heavy crystal glass, taking a grateful sip. The burn grounded him. The secondary shell company is rejecting the transfer protocols. It's not an automated flag. Someone on the receiving end is manually blocking the deposit. Sebastian frowned, dragging a chair over and sitting beside him. He leaned in, his shoulder brushing against Julian's. He felt entirely too solid, too warm in the cold, cavernous office. "Who controls the receiving node?" he asked, looking at the screen. "Javier Mendez." Julian pulled up a dossier on his second monitor. "Cartel lieutenant. He handles the regional distribution for the southern seaboard. Langdon used to deal with him directly." "Mendez is a paranoid sociopath," Sebastian noted, his voice flat. "If he's blocking the transfer, he suspects a trap. He knows Langdon is gone. He doesn't trust the new signature. He wants a face-to-face." Julian pointed to a secure message thread at the bottom of the screen. "He sent an encrypted ping an hour ago. He wants to meet the new director. Tomorrow night. Miami." Sebastian's posture changed instantly. The casual proximity vanished, replaced by a rigid, coiled tension. "No. It's not a request, Sebastian." Julian turned to face him. "The funds are in purgatory. If they sit there for another 48 hours, the federal algorithms will flag the volume. We lose $12 million. I said no." Sebastian stood up abruptly, pacing away from the desk, running a hand through his dark hair. "I'll go. I'll take a crew down to Miami. Sit down with Mendez. Force him to authorize the receiving codes." Julian swiveled his chair to face him. "You can't. Mendez doesn't want the muscle. He wants the architect. He needs to know that the person pushing the buttons isn't a federal agent who seized Langdon's laptop. If you show up with a crew, he'll burn the accounts and disappear. He is a cartel enforcer, Julian." Sebastian spun back, his eyes blazing. "He flays people alive for skimming. You are not going to sit down with him. I am the director of finance." Julian shot back, his voice rising, matching Sebastian's volume. He stood up, the exhaustion replaced by a sudden, fierce surge of adrenaline. "This is my route. This is my math. You put me in this chair to fix the machine. Let me fix it. You fix the numbers in here." Sebastian stepped into his space, closing the distance until they were inches apart. He was glaring down at Julian, his jaw locked. "You don't go into the field. You don't sit in a room with men who view human life as a rounding error. You don't put yourself in front of a man like Mendez." Julian stared up at him. He didn't back down. The air between them was electric, thick with anger and something far more dangerous. "Men like you?" he asked softly. Sebastian stopped. The words hit him like a physical blow. He stared at Julian, the anger in his eyes fracturing, revealing the raw, desperate panic hiding beneath it. He didn't want Julian safe because he was a valuable asset. He wanted him safe because the thought of Javier Mendez even looking at him made Sebastian's blood run cold. "I am not letting you walk into a cartel safe house," Sebastian said, his voice dropping to a rough, ragged whisper. "Then walk in with me." Julian's voice was steady, but his heart was hammering against his ribs. He didn't step back. "You don't bring the crew. You don't bring Marcus. You bring me. You are the Dawn. I am your proxy. We show him a united front. Mendez respects power. If he sees you backing my play, he'll release the hold." Sebastian looked at him. He looked at the harsh, uncompromising set of Julian's jaw, the dark fire in his eyes. Julian wasn't the mousy secretary anymore. He wasn't just a corporate shark. He was Sebastian's equal, his partner, his lover. He understood the violence, the risk, and he was willing to step into the blood to protect their empire. Sebastian reached out, his hand wrapping around Julian's upper arm. His grip was tight, possessive. "If anything goes wrong," Sebastian said, his thumb brushing against the silk of Julian's blouse, his eyes locked onto his. "If he even breathes in your direction the wrong way, the math doesn't matter anymore. I'll burn his entire operation to ash." Julian felt a shiver run down his spine that had absolutely nothing to do with the cold rain beating against the glass. "Understood," he murmured. "Pack a bag," Sebastian said, finally stepping back, though his eyes never left Julian's. "Wheels up at dawn." Miami did not care about the cold logic of New York. It was a city built on oppressive heat, blinding white sunlight, and humidity that felt like a physical weight on the chest. Javier Mendez chose a private, glass-walled conference room in a high-rise overlooking Biscayne Bay for the meeting. The air conditioning was cranked so high the room felt like a meat locker, a stark contrast to the blazing sun outside. It was an interrogation tactic. Mendez liked his guests uncomfortable. He sat at the head of a long marble table, flanked by two betas who wore expensive linen suits that bulged slightly at the waistbands. Mendez himself was in his late 40s, impeccably groomed, with a heavy gold watch catching the harsh overhead light. He did not stand when Sebastian and Julian walked in. Sebastian wore a lightweight charcoal suit, his expression a mask of absolute violent indifference. He pulled out a chair for Julian, waited for him to sit, and then took the seat beside him, completely ignoring the armed guards. Mendez leaned forward, resting his elbows on the marble. He looked at Sebastian first, offering a slow, calculated nod. Then his dark, dead eyes slid to Julian. Julian wore a bone-white suit, sharp and unyielding. He had tied his dark hair back into a low, severe knot at the nape of his neck. He looked like an executioner who had just scrubbed in, and his scent, unapologetic and powerful, filled the room like a challenge. An Omega's scent. Kane. Mendez's voice was a gravelly baritone. I expected a heavily armed entourage. Not you and an auditor. An Omega auditor. This is Julian Hart, Sebastian said softly. His voice didn't echo in the large room. It absorbed the sound around it. He is the director of finance for the Kane Syndicate. He is the architect of the new routing system. You wanted to see the person pushing the buttons. Here he is. Mendez laughed. It was a dry, scraping sound. Arthur Langdon was a rat, but he understood the ecosystem. He knew how to show respect. This boy sends me a digital ping demanding a $12 million release on a secondary node? I don't release cartel funds to strangers, especially strangers wearing lipstick. The two men flanking Mendez smirked. Julian didn't blink. He reached into his leather briefcase, pulled out a single thin manila folder, and slid it across the polished marble. It stopped precisely an inch from Mendez's clasped hands. Open it, Julian said. Mendez stopped smiling. He glanced at Sebastian, who remained perfectly still, watching the exchange with a dark, terrifying sort of pride. Mendez flipped the folder open. I don't demand respect, Mr. Mendez, Julian began, his voice calm, echoing slightly against the glass walls. I demand efficiency. When Arthur Langdon ran this route, the operational loss due to your handling fees was approximately 4% per quarter. You claimed it was necessary to bribe the port authorities in Belize City. Mendez stared at the single sheet of paper inside the folder. His face remained carefully blank, but a small muscle in his jaw ticked. I cross-referenced the port authority schedules with the holding company's wire transfers. Julian leaned back in his chair. You aren't bribing anyone. The digital signature on the receiving end of those 4% divergences belongs to a shell corporation registered in Panama. A corporation wholly owned by your brother-in-law. The room went dead silent. The hum of the aggressive air conditioning suddenly sounded deafening. The two guards shifted their weight, their hands drifting closer to their waistbands. Sebastian didn't move an inch, but his eyes tracked the guards. He was ready to kill them both before they cleared their holsters. Mendez looked up from the paper. The amusement was entirely gone. He looked at Julian as if he had just materialized a live grenade on the table. You are skimming from your own cartel bosses, Javier, Julian said, dropping the honorific. His tone was conversational, which made the threat infinitely worse. $12 million of my syndicate's money is currently sitting in a holding account. If you do not authorize the release codes in the next 3 minutes, I will hit a button on my phone. That button will forward this exact financial breakdown to the cartel's primary auditor in Sinaloa. I imagine they are far less forgiving of a 4% handling fee than Sebastian is. Mendez stared at him. He looked at the hard, uncompromising line of Julian's mouth, the utter lack of fear in his dark eyes. He was a man who trafficked in terror. And he realized with a sickening jolt that the Omega sitting across from him was entirely immune to it. Julian wasn't holding a gun. He was holding a spreadsheet, and it was going to get Mendez flayed alive. "You're bluffing," Mendez rasped. Julian picked up his phone from the table. He unlocked the screen. He didn't hesitate. His thumb hovered over the send icon. 2 minutes, Julian said. Mendez looked at Sebastian. "You're letting him do this? He's going to start a war." "He's doing the math, Javier." Sebastian's voice was a low, lethal hum. "I suggest you pay attention. He carries the one with extreme prejudice." Mendez looked back at the phone. He looked at the cold, clinical certainty in Julian's eyes. He swallowed hard. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a heavily encrypted satellite phone, and typed in a sequence of numbers. He placed the device on the table. A small green light blinked twice. "The hold is released." Mendez's voice was thick with suppressed rage. "The funds are routing to Belize." Julian looked at his own screen. He refreshed the mainframe application he had built. The $12 million vanished from the Purgatory account and safely deposited into the Kane Syndicate's primary offshore node. "Pleasure doing business with you, Javier." Julian stood up, smoothing the front of his white suit, and picked up the manila folder. He didn't leave it behind. "I will be sending a revised schedule for the Q4 transfers. I expect them to be processed without delay and without the 4% tax." Sebastian stood up. He didn't say a word to Mendez. He simply placed a hand on the small of Julian's back and guided him out of the freezing glass room, leaving the cartel enforcer sweating in the air conditioning. The adrenaline crash hit Julian the moment the heavy oak door of their hotel suite clicked shut. It was a sprawling, opulent penthouse overlooking the ocean, bathed in the warm, golden light of the late afternoon sun. But Julian didn't notice the view. His knees suddenly felt like they were made of water. He dropped his briefcase onto a glass coffee table and leaned heavily against the back of a plush sofa, pressing the heels of his hands into his eyes. His heart was beating so fast it physically hurt. He had just extorted a cartel boss. He had looked a murderer in the eye and threatened his life with a data transfer. "Drink." Sebastian's voice was quiet, grounding. Julian opened his eyes. Sebastian was standing in front of him, holding out a glass of neat bourbon. He had already discarded his suit jacket and tie. His sleeves were rolled up, revealing the dark ink of syndicate tattoos winding up his forearms. Julian took the glass. His hand was shaking so badly the amber liquid sloshed against the rim. He downed it in one burning swallow, gasping as the alcohol hit the back of his throat. Sebastian took the empty glass from his rigid fingers and set it on the table. He didn't step back. He stayed exactly where he was, invading Julian's space, his physical presence heavy and grounding. "You were shaking in the elevator," Sebastian said, his voice rough. "I'm terrified," Julian admitted, the truth tearing out of him. "I'm terrified almost every second of the day. I was terrified in the cubicle. I was terrified at the gala. I was terrified in that glass room. You didn't look it. That's the job." Julian looked up at him, his dark eyes bright with unshed tears. "You taught me that the men in this world only respect the armor. You don't let them see the blood." Sebastian stared down at him. The afternoon sun caught the dark, exhausted circles under Julian's eyes, the sharp line of his jaw, the fierce, unyielding intelligence that refused to break. He realized he had never seen anything more magnificent in his entire life. He reached out and gently pulled the severe knot from Julian's hair. The dark strands fell around his shoulders, framing his face. Julian didn't pull away. He leaned into Sebastian's touch, a microscopic surrender that sent a shockwave of heat straight to Sebastian's chest. "I spent 3 years walking past your desk," Sebastian murmured, his thumb tracing the line of Julian's cheekbone. 3 years looking right through you. It's the biggest failure of my life." "You were looking at the furniture," Julian said softly. "I was blind." Sebastian's voice was barely a whisper. "And I will spend the rest of my life making up for it." He didn't ask for permission, and Julian didn't require him to. Sebastian closed the final inch between them, his mouth coming down on Julian's. It wasn't gentle. It was a collision. 3 years of suppressed tension, The residual adrenaline of surviving a cartel sit-down and the violent, consuming realization that they were exact mirrors of each other. Julian grabbed the front of Sebastian's shirt, pulling him closer, matching his desperate intensity. He tasted like bourbon and danger. Sebastian tasted like power and cedar. Their hands roamed, exploring, claiming, tearing away the layers of armor they had both worn for so long. Sebastian backed Julian into the edge of the sofa, his hands finding the curve of his waist, anchoring him close. The kiss deepened, hungry and demanding. Julian's fingers tangled in Sebastian's dark hair, pulling him impossibly closer. When they finally broke apart, both gasping for air, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting the penthouse in deep, bruised shadows of purple and gold. Julian kept his hands fisted in Sebastian's shirt, his forehead resting against his chest, listening to the heavy, erratic thud of his heart. "Marcus is going to make a move," Julian said quietly, the reality of their world bleeding back into the room. "I know." Sebastian rested his chin on top of Julian's head. "He's bleeding money. Desperate. Desperate men get sloppy. He'll try to bypass the new protocols. And when he can't, he'll come for me. He won't get within 10 miles of you." Sebastian's voice hardened into absolute certainty. "If Marcus steps out of line, I won't reassign him. I'll bury him." Julian pulled back slightly, looking up into the cold, pale eyes of the dawn. "No," he said. Sebastian frowned. "No, don't bury him." Julian's voice was calm, but there was a deadly edge to it. "Audit him publicly. Strip his assets. Freeze his accounts. Force him to explain every stolen dime to the commission. Let him survive, but make him irrelevant. Death makes a martyr. Poverty makes a joke." Sebastian stared at him. A low, dark laugh rumbled in his chest. It was a sound of pure, unfiltered reverence. He had built a fortress of violence, and Julian had just shown him how to weaponize the architecture. "You," Sebastian whispered, leaning down to press a hard, possessive kiss to Julian's jaw, "are going to be the absolute ruin of this syndicate." "I am going to double your profit margins," Julian corrected, his hands sliding up to frame Sebastian's face. "And I'm going to look devastating doing it." The following Monday, Julian Hart walked onto the 42nd floor. The entire bullpen fell silent, watching him stride toward the executive suites. He didn't wear gray. He didn't look at the floor. He walked into the corner office, the glass door clicking shut behind him, sealing him into the empire he now co-ruled. The invisible secretary was dead. Long live the director. But before he could sit down, Sebastian appeared in the doorway of the private corridor. He was already rolling his sleeves up, a predatory smile on his face. "Change of plans," Sebastian said, his voice a low, hungry rumble. "Meetings in my office. Now." Julian raised an eyebrow. "What meeting?" "The one where we debrief on Miami." Sebastian's eyes gleamed. "Extensively. Privately." With the door locked, Julian felt a flush creep up his neck. "Sebastian, it's 9 in the morning. And?" Sebastian's grin widened. "I'm the Don. I make the rules." Julian shook his head, but he was smiling. He grabbed his tablet and followed Sebastian into the private corridor, letting the door close behind them. The Empire could wait.